The elevator doors opened, and the smell hit me. Bleach, sharp, clinical, familiar in a way I didn't want it to be. Not the sight of my father hooked up to machines. Not the ICU's blue-lit stillness, the slow beeping monitors, or the nurse's voice, quiet and practiced, saying he might not make it through the night. No, it was the bleach. That sterile tang soaked into hospital tiles, the kind that makes your nose sting and your throat clench. And all at once, I was 9 years old again, pressed against the wooden slats under my bed, holding my sister's hand so tightly her fingers went numb. He'd clean like that after the yelling. After something broke. After a silence so loud it swallowed whole evenings. The cleaning came not as remorse, but ritual. His way of restoring order to a world he'd just torn apart. I stepped into the hallway, the smell curling around me like smoke, and something inside cracked open. It's strange what stays with you. Not the worst moments, not the ones you'd circle in red if life were a timeline. It's the smells, the textures, the almosts. The way the floor creaked before he entered the room. The way he cleared his throat when he was about to ask a question he already knew the answer to. The weight of his keys on the kitchen counter. And bleach, always bleach. Even now, the scent makes my stomach twist like I'm bracing for something I can't name. I made it to his room. I stood there, just inside the door, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest beneath the hospital blanket. His left side was slack. One eye blinked slower than the other. Machines hummed quietly around him, more attentive than he'd ever been. His head turned slightly when he noticed me. "You finally show up," he rasped. I didn't answer. Just stood there with my hands in my coat pockets, the same way I used to stand in the living room after he'd called me downstairs without saying why. He looked away first. Even half paralyzed, he still knew how to deliver a dismissal. I stayed 5 minutes. Then I went back to the waiting room. I sat in one of those stiff vinyl chairs, the kind that makes your back ache after a while, and stared at a muted television looping old game shows. The other families around me whispered, murmured, comforted each other. I watched a woman in her 50s bring her elderly mother a cup of lukewarm tea. I saw a teenage boy fall asleep on his father's shoulder. Everyone had someone. I had a man down the hall who raised me like a drill sergeant disciplines a raw recruit. Through fear, silence, and the occasional blow softened by the excuse of tough love. The nurse came out to speak with me again. Her voice was kind but efficient. Someone who's done this dance with dozens of families, who knows not to expect too much. "He's stable for now," she said. "But it's serious. You're listed as next of kin. Are you prepared to make decisions if—" I nodded before she finished. I didn't want to hear the rest. Not because I was afraid, but because I already knew. I couldn't save him. And I wasn't sure I wanted to try. After she walked away, I checked my phone. 1 missed call from work, 2 unread texts from my partner. I responded to none of them. Instead, I walked to the parking lot. The cold hit me like a slap. Late November wind cutting through my coat, sky already bruising with twilight. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and sat. 27 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dash. Minute after minute, I stared at my hands on the steering wheel. They looked older than I remembered, veins more pronounced, knuckles more rigid. My father's hands, if I'm honest. I used to study them when he gripped the remote like a weapon, or slammed them down on the dinner table, or curled them into fists I hoped would stay at his sides. People think walking away from someone gets easier with time. It doesn't. It just gets quieter. The excuses get more polished, the guilt more familiar. But the ache never leaves. It settles into your bones like winter. And in that parking lot, I felt every one of those years, pressing against my ribs like a second heartbeat. I started the car. I backed out. And I drove 2 hours home, past amber-lit suburbs and long stretches of highway, past exits with names that tugged at memory, past the town where I graduated high school and swore I'd never come back. He's still alive, and I haven't gone back. My father wasn't the kind of man who hit you and then said sorry. He was the kind of man who didn't think he needed to apologize at all. He didn't fit the mold of what most people picture when they think abuse. He didn't drink, not much, anyway. He held down a job, paid the mortgage, mowed the lawn on Saturdays. There were no police calls, no visible bruises. If anything, from the outside, we probably looked fine. Average. Forgettable. But I learned early that danger doesn't always come with screaming or slamming doors. Sometimes it's in the way someone watches you from the other side of the dinner table. Sometimes it's in the silence, the kind that tightens your throat and makes you chew carefully, because the wrong sound might tip the balance. He believed in raising a man. That was his phrase. I'm raising a man, not a little pansy. He said it when I cried at my first skin knee. He said it when I hesitated at the top of the high dive. He said it when I asked, just once, if I could go live with my mom after she left. My mother was gone by the time I turned 8. I didn't understand why she left back then. She just stopped picking me up from school one day. Later, I learned it was more complicated, that she'd tried to fight for custody but couldn't afford a lawyer, that she'd been a different kind of broken. But at the time, all I knew was that I stayed, and she didn't, and that my father never let me forget it. She was weak, he'd say, usually while making dinner with the TV blaring behind him. Ran off, 'cause she couldn't hack it. You're stronger than that. You don't quit. Strength, to him, meant never crying, never asking for help, never hesitating. When I broke my wrist falling off my bike, I waited 3 hours to tell him. I sat in my room biting down on a washcloth until I could barely see straight. When he finally saw the swelling and took me to urgent care, he told the nurse, he's a tough one. Didn't complain once. She looked at me with something like pity. I remember wanting to disappear. There was no room in our house for softness. Emotions were threats to order. Joy was fine in moderation, if your team won the game, or if the steak came out right. But sadness? Vulnerability? Forget it. The first time I told him I felt anxious before a school presentation, he stared at me like I'd grown a second head. You nervous, he said. Then you're not prepared. Go practice until you're ready. Nervous is for people who fail. I used to think I hated him. As a teenager, I'd fantasize about storming out, slamming the door, telling him everything he'd done wrong. But hate requires energy, and living under his roof drained me of all of it. I didn't hate him. I adapted to him. I got good at reading moods, his, mine, the room's. I learned how to stay invisible when he was in one of his moods, how to perform just enough excellence to stay in his good graces. My report cards became a shield, my silence, a weapon. I learned how to stay small, compliant, efficient. And he praised that. That's my boy. Quiet. Smart. Knows when to speak and when to shut up. It took me until college to realize how warped that was. My first roommate, James, grew up in a house where his dad made pancakes on Sundays and asked how his day went just because. I didn't believe James at first. I thought he was exaggerating. Then I spent Thanksgiving with his family. I watched his dad take out the trash without being asked, hug James for no reason, and do the dishes after dinner while humming off-key to Bruce Springsteen. No raised voices. No icy stares. No walls with holes patched up in the drywall. That night, I cried in the guest room. Quietly, of course. Old habits. I told myself I'd never become like my father. But that was a lie. You carry the people who raised you in your spine, in the way you speak to yourself when no one's around. For years, every mistake I made came with an inner monologue in his voice. You idiot. You had one job. No excuses. I drove myself into exhaustion trying to earn a kindness I'd never been taught to give. Still, I stayed in touch with him. Not often. Holidays, mostly. Birthdays. A card here. A call there. I didn't love him. But I couldn't cut him off either. Maybe I still wanted something, acknowledgement, accountability, even just a moment where he looked at me and saw something other than a reflection of himself. That moment never came. And yet I answered when the hospital called. The call came on a Monday. Late morning. I was sifting through work emails when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it. When I finally did, a woman's voice on the other end informed me, calmly and professionally, that my father had suffered a stroke and had been admitted to County General. He hadn't asked for me. I was simply listed as the emergency contact. That detail stuck with me more than I expected. Not the stroke. Not the hospital. Not the possibility that he might die. Just the fact that I was still tethered to him by paperwork, by some form he probably filled out without thinking, defaulting to the only person left who hadn't entirely disappeared. When I hung up, I stared at my desk for a while. Then I stood, grabbed my keys, and left without telling anyone where I was going. The drive to the hospital was oddly calm. No pounding heart, no adrenaline, no rush of memories. Just the usual highway hum and the occasional glance at the GPS. I remember noticing the sky was overcast, that mid-November gray that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. I also remember not feeling much at all. Not fear, not grief. Just a kind of blank readiness, like walking into a meeting you didn't want to attend but knew you couldn't skip. Hospitals have a way of stripping people down to their essentials. The pale lights, the generic wall art, The neutral smells, except, of course, for the bleach. That hit me hard. The scent wafted into the elevator the moment the doors opened. Not overpowering, but sharp enough to snap me out of whatever mental buffer I'd wrapped myself in. It was the same smell I'd grown up with, not from hospitals, but from our kitchen floor, the one he scrubbed after bad nights. That scent had soaked into my childhood like wallpaper. Bleach always followed destruction. After the yelling, after the broken plates, after I'd spent hours hiding in a corner of my closet, holding my breath, waiting for the storm to pass. The cleaning never meant an apology. It was control, restoration, the erasure of evidence. Standing in that elevator, surrounded by the ghost of that smell, I felt like I was 12 again. My palms began to sweat. My throat tightened. I don't know how long I stood there before the doors closed again and the elevator moved. Seeing him in the hospital bed was a jolt, but not for the reasons I expected. He looked smaller than I remembered. Fragile, even. Tubes ran from his arm. A monitor blinked quietly behind him. His mouth sagged slightly on one side, and his eyes opened slowly, as if each movement cost him something. What surprised me most wasn't the physical decline. It was the familiarity of the dynamic. Even like this, even now, the atmosphere around him demanded something. Reverence, attention, maybe fear. The years hadn't erased that. They had only dulled its volume. I sat in the room for a while. He drifted in and out of sleep, occasionally waking with a scowl or a half-formed sentence. I didn't respond. I just watched. There was nothing to say that hadn't been said or swallowed long ago. That first day was mostly logistics. I met with a social worker. I filled out forms. I checked in with the nurse. I answered questions I'd never wanted to be responsible for. Medical history, next of kin, advance directives. I went through the motions like a clerk processing someone else's case file. But something shifted on the second night. A quiet moment, just before I left, when I saw a flicker of self-pity cross his face. Not remorse, not reflection, just a kind of wounded pride. And I realized he didn't see himself the way I did. He never had. He saw himself as the one who stayed. The one who paid the bills, kept the lights on, cooked the meals. He probably believed that was enough. That endurance was love. That survival was the same as care. And maybe part of me had once believed that too. He gave what he could. But what he had to give was sharp-edged, conditional, and often laced with bitterness. He taught me discipline, but not safety. Self-reliance, but not kindness. Strength, but only the kind that hides its wounds. He gave me tools, but no blueprint. And for years, I used them to build walls, not homes. That second night, as I sat in the hospital cafeteria staring into a cup of coffee gone cold, I thought about how strange it is to care for someone who never truly cared for you, not in the way you needed. It's not hatred that lingers in the wake of that kind of relationship. It's something quieter, more confusing, like loyalty with a limp. I went back to his room before I left. He was asleep again, snoring faintly, jaw slack. The TV was on, but muted. I stood there for a few minutes, taking him in, the man who raised me, who broke me, who believed he was doing his best. I left without waking him. Outside, in the parking lot, I sat in my car for 27 minutes. Then I drove home. I stayed 2 more days. Not because I wanted to. Not because I thought anything would change. I stayed because leaving without trying felt too final. And somewhere, buried beneath the distance I'd carved out over the years, there was still that old programming, the one that told me good sons show up. Each day followed the same rhythm. Morning check-ins with nurses. Paperwork. Small talk in the elevator. Visits to his room that stretched into quiet hours where neither of us said much, if anything. Sometimes he watched TV with the sound off. Sometimes he slept. Sometimes he stared at me with a look I couldn't decipher. Resentment, maybe, or confusion, or the disorienting fact of his own dependency. I offered small gestures of care. I brought socks. I helped adjust his blankets. I refilled his water. He tolerated it all in silence, as if he couldn't decide whether my presence was an insult or a debt finally paid. What unsettled me most wasn't his anger or bitterness. It was the vacuum of recognition. He didn't seem to see me, not really. Just a body fulfilling a role. A default son stepping into default duties. I kept waiting for something to break through the static. A flicker of warmth, or sorrow, or even guilt. But it never came. If anything, he seemed inconvenienced by my presence. As if this whole ordeal, the stroke, the hospital, my face, was another reminder that he was no longer in control. On the second evening, just after sunset, I found myself in the hospital chapel. It wasn't intentional. I had wandered past it while looking for a vending machine. The room was dim, empty except for a flickering LED candle and a guest book on a stand. The air smelled faintly of dust and flowers past their prime. I sat in the back row and let my mind go blank. Grief is a strange thing when it's preemptive, when it's for someone who isn't gone yet, and maybe never really showed up in the first place. It's not the grief of loss. It's the grief of never having had what you needed and knowing it's too late now to ask for it. That was the weight I felt in that chapel. Not sadness, not anger, just a hollow ache. Like someone had carved out all the soft parts of me a long time ago, and I was only now noticing the space they left behind. When I returned to his room, he was sleeping again, face turned toward the window. The sky outside was a soft, hazy blue. The machines beside him beeped in steady rhythm. It all looked very peaceful, almost cinematic. But I knew better. Peace wasn't part of our vocabulary, only détente. I stood there for a while, watching him breathe. This was the man who had once thrown a chair because I got a B in math. The man who refused to come to my college graduation because it was just a piece of paper. The man who hadn't met my partner after 5 years together because, as he once said in a rare phone call, I don't do all that lifestyle stuff. And now here he was, half silent, half still, half alive, expecting, maybe, that I would fill in the blanks, patch up the story, make it make sense. But I couldn't. Not because I didn't want to forgive, but because he'd never asked. There was no bridge to cross. Only distance. Unacknowledged, untreated, uninterrogated distance. And I was tired of being the one to close it. That night, I packed my bag. No scene. No note. No announcement. I walked out of the hospital, down the same corridor that smelled of bleach and artificial calm. Past the check-in desk, past the elevators, past the waiting families clutching styrofoam cups of coffee and quiet prayers. Outside, the wind had picked up. It stung my face as I walked to my car. The air was cold and sharp, but honest in a way the hospital wasn't. I sat behind the wheel and looked at the building one last time. A flat, beige silhouette against a colorless sky. And then I drove. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not my partner, not my sister, not the few friends I occasionally confided in about my father. I just went home and pretended the trip had been uneventful. Said it was hard, and that he was stable for now. Both technically true, both utterly hollow. In the following days, I returned to my routine. Coffee, emails, meetings, dishes. Everything around me kept moving, and I tried to let myself believe that I was, too. But beneath the surface, I was orbiting something heavy, something unsaid. I kept waiting to feel something definitive. Relief, maybe. Or guilt sharp enough to pierce the fog. But what I felt instead was a muted ache, like a pulled muscle I kept forgetting was injured until I moved the wrong way. What surprised me was how little anyone asked. No one pushed for details. Maybe they sensed the lines I'd drawn. Maybe they didn't want to wade into the messy territory between obligation and self-preservation. Or maybe, deep down, they didn't see him as someone worth mourning either. I followed his condition in small, detached ways. A distant cousin, more of a name than a person, posted on Facebook that he'd been moved to a care facility. There was no mention of visitors, no hint of recovery or decline. Just a line about insurance and another about prayers for healing. I didn't react. I didn't like the post. He was still alive. That was enough information. And still, the decision echoed. Some mornings, I'd wake up with the distinct feeling that I'd left something burning on the stove. A low hum of anxiety that something, some version of me, some old debt, was still out there, unfinished. Other mornings, I felt like I could finally breathe. For years, I'd carried this low-grade fever of tension whenever his name came up, or when holidays approached, or when my phone rang from an unlisted number. I'd been emotionally bracing for decades, preparing for the fallout, for the final chapter, for the moment when I'd be expected to bury a man who never once knew how to hold me without judgment. And now, I'd opted out. Not out of cruelty, not even out of anger, just refusal. Refusal to keep pretending the story had another act. Refusal to turn my care into a currency he never learned to earn. Refusal to keep shrinking myself into the son he thought I should be. But that didn't mean it felt clean, or righteous, or resolved. Some nights, I'd replay those last hours in the hospital, wondering if I missed something, some tiny crack in the armor that could have led to connection, or peace, or softness. I wondered if I gave up too soon. If I was too hardened, too tired, too unwilling to entertain the possibility that he, too, might have been trapped inside himself all those years. Because here's the thing I don't like admitting. He probably didn't know how to be different. He came from a lineage of men who only knew power, control, and silence. Men who measured love by provision and parenting by performance. He gave what he was taught to give. And maybe, in his own distorted way, he thought that was enough. But understanding that doesn't erase the harm. It doesn't unteach the lessons I've spent years unlearning. It doesn't make my hands unclench when someone raises their voice. It doesn't stop my heart from racing when I get something wrong, even now, even in safe places. He gave what he had, and I needed more than that. So I left, not because it was brave, not because it was just, but because I couldn't keep waiting for someone who never really arrived. I've since told a few people. My partner knows everything now. We sat on the couch one night, me with a glass of wine I barely touched, and I laid it all out. Not the dramatic version, not the edited one, but the whole quiet truth. They didn't judge me. They just listened, rubbed my back, stayed close. That moment, strangely, felt more like family than anything I ever shared with my father. I've learned that chosen family isn't just about who shows up. It's about who sees you, who accepts you without keeping score, who holds space not just for your story, but for your silence, and who doesn't ask you to perform pain to earn comfort. There are still days when I wonder what it would take to walk back into that hospital. What I'd say, what he'd say, if anything. But most days, I know the door I closed wasn't just his. It was the one I used to keep propped open for the sake of hope. And sometimes, shutting it is the only way not to freeze. It's been 3 months. Long enough for the world to move on. The seasons have shifted, the days stretch a little longer, and I found myself laughing more than I expected. Not constantly, not without effort, but enough to notice. Grief hasn't arrived in the way I thought it might. No sudden collapse. No dramatic tears. Just small, persistent shadows. The kind that linger in quiet moments. Loading the dishwasher. Hearing a certain song. Watching a father help his child zip up their coat on the street. Sometimes I feel nothing. Sometimes I feel everything. And most of the time, I float somewhere in between, aware that something fundamental changed, even if I can't quite name it. I haven't reached out. Neither has he. He's still alive, last I heard. Still in the care facility, still largely uncommunicative, according to the occasional updates that make their way to me through relatives I barely know. No one's asked me to visit. Maybe they sense the boundary I've drawn. Maybe they assume I'm grieving in my own way. Maybe they just don't care enough to ask. I haven't tried to explain it to anyone who wouldn't understand. This kind of estrangement lives in a space that doesn't translate well. People want a narrative they can follow, one with cause and effect, victim and villain, pain and apology. But most of us live in the middle spaces. And this story isn't about a singular breaking point. It's about erosion. Slow, silent, invisible to anyone who wasn't there. I think the hardest part is that there's no one to blame, not fully. And that feels unfair in a different way. I don't hate him. I never really did. Hatred requires heat, a kind of focus I stopped giving him years ago. What I feel is colder, more complicated, a kind of grieving for someone who never existed. The father I needed, the one who might have held my fear instead of feeding it, who might have seen my softness as something to protect, not shame. He was never real. Just a silhouette I chased through every holiday phone call, every strained birthday message, every act of patience I offered like currency. There's a freedom in naming that loss for what it is. And there's guilt, too. A guilt that doesn't come from doing something wrong, but from doing what's necessary and still feeling like maybe you could have been different. Better. More forgiving. Less guarded. More generous. But the truth is, I've spent most of my life being generous in ways that cost me. I've poured empathy into a vessel with no bottom. And at some point, I had to choose between continuing to give or learning to keep something for myself. I don't regret leaving the hospital, but I also don't feel triumphant about it. There was no catharsis, just a quiet decision made on a cold evening, driven by exhaustion more than anger, self-preservation more than spite. That choice didn't heal anything. It just stopped the bleeding. What has helped is letting other people in. People who don't ask me to be anything but honest. My partner, who never once asked me to justify my distance. My friends, who showed up with food and warmth and didn't expect anything back. My therapist, who reminds me that boundaries are not betrayals, even when they feel like abandonment. I've started writing more, not just about him, but about me, about the parts of myself I abandoned long ago in order to survive him. I'm trying to unlearn the script he gave me, that love must be earned, that care is conditional, that silence is strength. It's a slow process. Some days I regress, but other days I catch myself offering myself grace, and I realize that maybe I'm becoming someone I needed all along. I don't know if he'll die soon, or if he'll linger for years in that half-present state. I don't know if he thinks of me, if he's angry, or if, in the quiet of that room, he started to reflect in ways he never did before. Maybe he's still rewriting history, casting himself as the provider, the one who stayed. Maybe he believes that should have been enough. And maybe, in his world, it was. But in mine, it wasn't. That doesn't make either of us entirely wrong. It just makes us human, flawed, limited, shaped by wounds we didn't choose and legacies we didn't ask to inherit. Still, I wonder, if he called me tomorrow, if someone put a phone in his hand and dialed my number, would I pick up? Would I listen? Would I go back? I want to say no. I want to say that I've closed that chapter. But the truth is, I don't know. All I know is that I left. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look back to see if I was being followed. That, in itself, felt like a kind of peace.